It will not likely come as much of a surprise to many of you beyond our instinctive awareness that the more wealthy people become, the less empathetic they seem to be. But researchers at Berkeley and the University of Illinois have actually put numbers to it, that generally speaking, the more wealthy a person becomes, the less they seem to care about those who are under the heel of poverty and oppression. When you personally feel some food insecurity, you are easily more understanding of those who are hungry. When you've had a house repossessed, or you've had to move back in with mom and dad after college, you can feel the imposing threat of homelessness much more clearly. But comfort and security, after you've had it for a long time, can lull us into indifference. That when you are pretty sure that if you run out of food at the house, all you're going to have to do is go to the grocery store and you can always buy groceries, that you're not really worried about making your next house note. It gets to a point where you're unsympathetic with people that seem to always be in trouble. I always meant to do it before during my many years as a denominational pastor, but I always had some excuse about being too busy. But when we decided to start this church, I made it a part of my personal, spiritual, and professional discipline to spend time every week with the most poor and the most vulnerable people that I could find. So our weekly trips to Bill's Place, where we serve lunch on Thursdays, keeps me in touch with reality. I need to always remember that whatever I'm doing professionally, whatever I'm writing, whatever I'm working on, if it doesn't have a direct link to the reality of crushing poverty and violence and crime, then it doesn't really matter. Theology cannot be a matter of something that goes on between your ears. It has to have an implication on the sidewalks. Sometimes, though, when we go there on Thursdays, one of our regulars will reappear after months of absence, and I'll say, well, where have you been? And a lot of times the answer is, I've been a guest at the guest house of the Greene County government, which means that they've just done a little term in jail. Through my contact with the homeless population, I know a lot of people who have been at least short-term guests in the Greene County Jail. But there are two prisoners there that have a connection to our church. One is a child molester, and the other is charged with murder. The child molester was the most recently incarcerated. I sat in the courtroom last month next to his victim and the victim's mother as her former stepfather pled guilty to several charges against him. It took over 3 years to bring that case to court. So our friends and church members with whom I sat in court have been forced to move 3,000 miles away to escape his constant stalking and threats, which our local judicial system seemed powerless to stop, in spite of multiple felony charges against him and a restraining order. But we just couldn't get it brought to court soon enough or make them safe enough to stay in this part of the country. Now, he's going to be in jail for several months. He'll be brought up for sentencing this summer, at which time he is likely to be sent to a state prison for, in my opinion, not nearly long enough. The other prisoner has already been there for 3.5 years. She was charged with murder. She had just turned 18 at the time. She had run away from home years before, became a drug addict, and was turning tricks on the street to feed her addiction. She evidently shot a middle-aged John with his own gun while sitting in the car. She was too high to remember what happened. There were no other witnesses. Why her case has not been brought to trial in over 3.5 years and why she is still a resident in the Greene County Jail defies all legal or logical explanation. A county jail is supposed to be a holding facility where people who are charged with crimes are held for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, pending their hearing. No one is supposed to be there for a month, certainly not 6 months, and a year should be unheard of. 3 years is nothing short of crazy. County jails are not set up with rehab or counseling or education or the kinds of resources that you provide to long-term residents in state or federal prisons. A jail is not a prison. However, due to long backlogs in our court system, they say we don't have enough judges, they say we don't have enough public defenders, that we don't have enough prosecutors. Our jail has started to function as a prison. A facility that was built to house 500 prisoners has been over capacity for 3 years. A recent newspaper article about Dr. David Adams' granddaughter, Maria, now in her 3rd year in jail, describes the overcrowding conditions. There are 2 beds in Maria's cell, but there are often 4 women in the cell. They have to take turns then sleeping on the floor, but the cell is so small that 2 people can't lie down fully in the cell. One has to prop her head up on the shared toilet. I don't know how that's legal. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that it's not legal, though as I've been researching the topic, I've found that overcrowding exists in county jails all across the country. The ACLU is aware of it. They've documented it. You can find information about it on their website, but I can't find where they filed any lawsuits about it. Now, many of you know that I'm a news junkie. I listen to podcasts while I exercise. I wake up to and I go to sleep to news programming. I know I shouldn't. No one else needs to tell me to not do it, but I know several things that I should do that I don't do, so that just kind of goes on the list. I leave the news on all night. I sleep to the company of the comforting voices of MSNBC news anchors every night except for weekends. On the weekends, MSNBC runs repeats of hours and hours and hours of reporting on prisons, federal prisons, state prisons, and foreign prisons. It's sort of like the Real Housewives of incarceration. I can't stand it. So I have to search for documentaries and other news sources to lull me into sleep on the weekends. I cannot stand watching and hearing about the scary people and the frightening conditions in these prisons, and yet I know that conditions are much worse just 3 miles from where we are right now at the Greene County Jail. In the Academy Award-winning film Spotlight, the 4 reporters who worked for the Boston Globe, who broke the Catholic priest abuse story in Boston, repeatedly find themselves asking each other in the course of the movie, how could this go on? How could there have been 90 and in the end nearly 300 priests in the Boston diocese who had been abusing children for generations? So many parents knew, so many church officials, so many police and judges and prosecutors. How could it have gone on? Why? Why wasn't it stopped? The sobering, in fact, the morally indicting realization that dawned on the reporters after they finally produced the stories is that they had all sort of known. There had been bits and pieces of information. I suspect there have been signs, there was evidence for years. It's just that no one wanted to think about it. No one wanted to look at something so ugly, so unholy, so disgusting. I remember as a kid in high school reading the satirical magazine National Lampoon. 40 years ago, they talked about pedophile priests. They wrote about it in cartoons as if it was an understood fact. We've all known about it all of our lives. But it wasn't until these 4 reporters brought documentation together, put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and printed it in a way that was so prominent that it couldn't be ignored any longer. And it didn't just strike at Boston at that point. It went global, and it turns out the problem was even much worse in Ireland than it was in the United States. And these were crimes committed against innocent, vulnerable, gullible children. And we were able to accept this horrible thing going on right under our noses. And we all knew kids that we knew it was going on, and yet we knew kids that were being sent to parochial schools, who sang in the choirs, who were in the altar guilds, who were in position of risk, and we didn't do anything about it. And if we can diminish these children to the point that we can live comfortably with the knowledge that this gargantuan institution of the Roman Catholic Church could incorporate such abuse, and that it went on probably for centuries, how much easier it is then for us to dismiss the plight of those who are incarcerated, most of whom are incarcerated for a good reason. They've done something really bad. And yet men and women, even prisoners of war, are not bunched up into little tiny cells. The Geneva Conventions show greater kindness to enemies of our nation than we show to members of our own families who are incarcerated in this county. And yes, everything that you might imagine happens in those overcrowded conditions. I have talked with guards who tell me that they hear the screams, they know that rapes are occurring, they know that physical assaults are occurring, they know what kind of violence goes on, and they say that in that overcrowded condition, that there's nothing that they can do about it. Putting a lot of offenders in overcrowded conditions makes them harder to manage. So it's not the guards' fault that there are rapes and beatings, no opportunities to even let them exercise or to move about in an enclosure outside. It's not the guards' fault. The sheriff is in charge of the jail, and he is frustrated and angry about the situation. But as he has said repeatedly in newspaper stories, it's not up to him to expand the capacity of the jail, and he cannot legally just turn criminals loose. So it's not the sheriff's fault. The overcrowding largely comes from longer stays in prison waiting for their day in court. But the prosecutor's office and the public defender's offices are understaffed and overworked, and they swear that it is not their fault. The legislature would have to approve more judges and prosecutors and defenders, but the state budget is already tight and the people don't want to pay more taxes, and so it's not the legislator's fault. So I ask you, my sisters and brothers, we are treating human beings, and some are bad people, some are innocent people, some people who are guilty of nothing more complicated than being an addict, which is a medical condition and not a legal condition. Some of them are just people who were unlucky enough to not have parents who could afford to hire a better attorney. We, not they, we are treating them in a way that if the humane shelter was treating cats and dogs that way, and this is ironic to say, the people running the humane shelter would go to jail. If we treated cats and dogs the way we are treating David Adams' granddaughter, it'd be a punishable offense. So we know it's happening, and we know it's wrong, and we know it's unacceptable. So now what? We started this church 8 years ago. We said that we wanted to be a prophetic church. I hope you remember that. That's supposedly in our DNA. We said that being a prophetic church happens in two different ways. One is by giving direct aid to people who are in need. So we distribute groceries through cross lines, we take meals to Bill's place, we send shoes to Nicaragua, we distribute tents and sleeping bags and coats and gloves to the homeless every winter. One way of being prophetic is giving direct aid to people in need. But the other way of being prophetic is to speak truth to power. And in this case, to tell our county commissioners, our sheriff, our mayor, our city council, our legislators, our prosecutor's office, our judges, that no matter what the budget is, no matter what their workload is, no matter what the bureaucratic hurdles they have, that is no reason to treat human beings as being subhuman. It is not okay. I'm saying if you can put them in jail and treat them like human beings, okay. But if you can't, then you can't put them in jail. You cannot keep blowing air into a bottle. You cannot take away someone's humanity. There are some people in there whose crimes are disgusting to me, But the fact that they're disgusting to me does not justify our county government committing disgusting crimes against these people. Because they're criminals doesn't mean that we should be criminals. Because they have done things against other people's human rights doesn't mean that we should. We must speak truth to power. There have been stories about jail overcrowding in the paper for the past several years. It's going to take more than that to change it. Simply pointing out the fact that it's wrong is not enough. Our officials know how bad it is. They know how wrong it is. But until today, they've been comfortable in the knowledge that you don't care. And maybe they're right. Maybe no one does care. But I'm prepared to say today that they're wrong. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to make them understand how wrong they are. I talked with the mayor, and I said, "Do you have a solution?" And he said the only solution will be when someone files a suit on behalf of a prisoner against the county to bring it to court. That doesn't really sound like church work, does it? But maybe it should.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.